Hi, so in today's lecture, I just want to give you a brief overview of the nervous system. Okay, so 15 minutes, we're going to sort of hit all the highlights. Obviously, this is a really complex system, so I can really just give you kind of a little taste of it, but hopefully you'll find this interesting. So the nervous system can be divided into two main branches. There's the central nervous system, or the CNS, and that's what's really doing all the integration, coordination, site of intelligence. This is kind of what we think of as what the nervous system is doing. And then the peripheral nervous system is basically how the central nervous system is communicating to the outside, to the body, and it's receiving information and then sending information back out again. Okay, so here's a diagram of that. So here's a central nervous system. So this is going to include the brain and spinal cord, and this is where information processing is occurring. And then the peripheral nervous system is basically going to gather information. So it's going to gather information from all the senses. So touch, heat, visual, taste, any sort of sense. Deliver that information to the brain. All right, and then the brain is going to then send out the motor information. And the motor information is either going to, let's say, tell you to move an arm or a leg. That's part of the somatic nervous system. This is the voluntary system, what we control, what we actually can think about and then do. All right, or it can actually send out motor information via the autonomic nervous system. This is what we're not aware of. So it can increase or decrease the heart rate, increase how digestion's occurring. So things that we're not really aware of, but that are a response to the information the brain received. All right. That autonomic nervous system can be divided into the sympathetic division, which we refer to as the fight or flight. This is what's going to make you alert, make you aware of danger and what to do if that happens, kind of get ready to run or deal with emergencies. Parasympathetic is the opposite. This is more the rest and digest system. So this is what's going to be more in control when you're sleeping, for instance. All right, some organs are innervated by one or the other, but most vital organs have both. And this kind of makes sense because let's say if you're the heart, there are times that you want your heart to increase heart rate and get ready to do some physical activity, but then you also want to have a way to slow it down when you need to sleep or conserve energy. So those two systems kind of work against each other, and depending on what you need, you may have a little bit more of one or the other. All right, and here's a diagram of the various things each system does. So here's the parasympathetic, so it slows the heart, stimulates digestion. The sympathetic, on the other hand, accelerates the heart, makes you breathe faster, all right, releases glucose, and secretes epinephrine. So epinephrine is also known as adrenaline. So these are things that are going to make you more alert. All right, the spinal cord. So we talked about the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. So the spinal cord receives some of that sensory information and then also sends out via nerves that motor information. There's 31 segments. So here's a diagram. And notice if you're a nerve sort of at the base of the spinal cord, that still has to get all the way to your foot. So that's a really long cell. And we'll come back to that in a minute. And then here's a cross-section of the spinal cord. So basically, sensory neurons are going to come in, and then motor neurons leave on sort of the opposite side. All right. One of the things the spinal cord controls is reflexes. So reflexes are things that responses you do without thinking about it, right? The classic is you put your hand on something hot. You may notice you're pulling your hand away before you really even register pain. And that's because the reflex just goes through the spinal cord and back out the motor neuron. There's no thought. You're not sending any information up to the brain. The pain is when that information gets to the brain, so it takes a little bit longer. Okay, the simplest reflex is the knee-jerk reflex. So you've all gone to the doctor and had your knee hit with the little hammer. Okay, so here's the little hammer. What it's doing is it's actually stretching this tendon here. And when you stretch that tendon, it alerts this receptor in this muscle. And that sensory nerve sends an impulse to the spinal cord. And it just delivers this directly to the motor neuron. So there's really just two neurons or two nerve cells. And then this motor neuron tells this muscle to contract. That straightens the foot, and notice it's going to release the tension on that tendon. So that's the knee-jerk reflex. There's a whole bunch of other ones. Some actually have more neurons involved, so they take a little bit longer. This is the simplest and the quickest reflex arc. All right, so that's the spinal cord. The human brain, again, I'm just going to say a little bit about it. Feel free to pause if you want to, read a little bit more. But basically, it's about 3 pounds, right? It's bathed in fluid. So between your brain and the skull and around your spinal cord, there's actually cerebrospinal fluid, which cushions, protects, it transports nutrients, removes waste. So you may hear that sometimes if somebody does like a spinal tap, they're taking out a little bit of the cerebrospinal fluid. All right, and then some regions in the brain. Again, this is really complex, so we're just going to kind of briefly go over some of the main ones. The cerebrum is probably what you think of when you think of a picture of the brain. This is that highly folded sort of outer region. It's divided in the left and right sides, and we call them cerebral hemispheres. And this is where we think of as like higher thought patterns. So intellectual functions, memory storage and retrieval, complex motor patterns. All right, we kind of think of this part of the brain as what makes us human. And our cerebral hemispheres are bigger and more highly folded than other mammals, for instance. Okay, the cerebellum, on the other hand, is going to regulate movements that we're not really in control of. This is more the autonomic system. So you may not think of when you're sitting or walking, but your muscles are constantly functioning to keep your posture, okay, and maintain balance and equilibrium. And once you've learned a movement, you don't need to think about to keep doing it. So when you're walking or riding a bike, that's controlled by your cerebellum, okay? We also have a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, and this is actually the link between the brain and the endocrine or hormone system. The midbrain processes sight and hearing input. It controls some muscle tone, posture as well. And we also think there's some centers there that may play a role in consciousness. The pons is where the involuntary control of breathing. And then the medulla oblongata controls autonomic functions such as heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and digestion. So again, these are sort of the autonomic functions. And if we look at a picture here of the brain, you'll notice here's that cerebral hemisphere, and you notice all these folds, all right? And it actually is covering up a lot of the other parts of the brain. So if you sort of remove this outer cerebral hemisphere, here's the midbrain, right, this green here, and here's the hypothalamus. Remember, that's the link between the nervous system and the endocrine. And then here you have the pons, the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata actually is going to eventually turn into the spinal cord. So if you think of this is sort of the connection, all right, and then the cerebellum is right here. So sometimes we refer to this area where the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum as sort of the brain stem. And these are all controlling those autonomic functions that we don't have to think about to do, but that we need to obviously keep breathing and doing all of those things. Okay, so we've been talking about neurons. So hopefully you know that that's the main cell of the nervous system. And we have two types. We have sensory neurons that are basically taking information from the outside in. So those are things that are going to relay touch, temperature, pressure, senses. The motor neurons then carry out commands from the CNS to muscles or glands or other organs. And then there are a variety of neurons that connect these together into sort of very intricate systems. And these are located entirely in the brain and spinal cord. So these are totally in the central nervous system. All right, and if we look at the anatomy of a neuron, we have the cell body, and this is what we think of when we learn like cell structure. Most of that's going to be in the cell body. Dendrites receive the signals, an axon then transmits it to other cells, and then in between either neurons or neurons in other cells is the synapse or the synaptic terminals. So if we look at a picture, all right, so incoming information is received on the dendrites. Then we have the cell body. So this is, you can see there's a nucleus here. These are all the cell organelles we talked about when we talked about cells. And then here's this long, thin axon. Remember, this has to be as long as your leg to get down to those muscles. And here it's synapsing on muscle, but it could synapse with other nerves as well. And then when you have a whole bunch of those axons that run together, that's what's actually making up a nerve. And a nerve is actually big enough that you can see it because it has, probably thousands of actual neurons as part of that nerve. Okay, so how do these nerve cells communicate? So the signal travels as changes in electrical activity, all right, and that's referred to as an action potential. We're not going to get into the exact details right now, but I just want you to know it involves changes in charges across the cell membrane, and the action potential is generated basically in the cell body, and it goes down the axon. So it's one way, and then here at the synapse, right, notice it doesn't touch the next cell. There's a little space here. And notice there's these vesicles that are filled with these little red dots in this instance. So this is exocytosis. Do you remember that word? All right, so we're going to fuse these vesicles, and then they let out these little red dots. These little red dots are neurotransmitters. So they're chemicals that then diffuse across this gap, and they then bind with receptors on the other cell. And then this initiates some response in this cell. So these neurotransmitters are really important for cell communication within the nervous system. And if we look, here's some examples: acetylcholine, serotonin, dopamine, and there's a ton of others. And people are still probably discovering neurotransmitters and how they work. And these are involved in all brain activities, including learning and emotions, and how these cells are communicating. So a lot of drugs, for instance, that treat various different types of problems that may arise in the central nervous system are going to affect how these neurotransmitters act. So one class of these are the SSRIs. So these are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So if I go back, right, these neurotransmitters, they don't stay in the synapse forever. Eventually the cell takes it up again, because if they stayed here forever, then you couldn't really control the signal. All right, but sometimes if, let's say, you don't have enough serotonin, well, what you want to do is you take a drug that then prevents the cells from taking it back up. So then what serotonin you do have will stay in the synapse longer, and so you get a better response from it. Okay, and serotonin is one of those things that's involved in mood. And so people take these SSRIs for various types of depression, for example. And there's a lot of other drugs that can affect, or at least we think they affect, how neurotransmitters work. There's ones that affect acetylcholine. There's some that affect dopamine. And so that's one way that we can treat various types of neurological disorders. Okay, so I know that was quick and there was a lot of information, but I hope you learned something interesting, and at least maybe learned a few words that you didn't know before, or maybe it helped explain some that you've heard. We'll do a little bit more with the nervous system, and then we will be done with our human body systems. All right, see you next time.